Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another fantastic Revolution gathering. Hope you all had a lovely Halloween, a lovely week. I'm having some of my tax from my kids. I get the 100 grand. They call it the old man candy. So hopefully you all can hear me well. Hope you're all having a great morning. Probably not the best idea to be chewing food, huh? Okay. I'll just have a bite of it. Get the rest later. Just need a little sugar, a little energy for the talk. Yes, caramel. Bad idea. Forgive me. Got my nicotine mints here as well. Let me apologize for chewing my 100 gram. If anybody wants to send 100 grand, I'll send you a candy bar. Yeah, so last week, Brian Yarborough, my Revolution partner and friend, flew right here into Seattle, and we had a meeting. We hung out because we're good buddies. We went and saw Tron. Wasn't the greatest, but in 3D it was really awesome. Totally worth seeing it in 3D if you want my personal opinion. And there you go. But we just had a meeting about the future of Revolution and things we'd like to do and things we'd like to be able to do and how to cut some things in the budget and how to raise money and just do more work. How to provide more online content and just in-person content. So yeah, it's Chuck and Linda, hey guys. So yeah, it was a great weekend of just kind of sitting down and meeting. One of the things that we did realize, which is really great news, is that our downloads since the beginning of this year have tripled. And I think a lot of that comes to really grateful and thanks to Brian Yarborough coming in, and we're having kind of able to have a bit more of a consistent release date, and all the clips that we've been able to put up and things like that. And so we just continue to kind of dive in and see areas where we can improve Revolution and how we can do more. So it was a really successful weekend, and had a great time hanging out with Brian as well. He is out of the country right now, so having the talks on time might not happen today. Might not happen this week because he's out of the country. And I don't expect him to. He's out his own job where he makes his own money doing his work. So I don't expect him to stop in the middle of his negotiations or whatever he's doing overseas and just throw this up. But hopefully we'll be up in a timely manner. Man, I had fun with my kids on Halloween. We made a lot of my kids got a lot of candy, and it was raining. It seems to always rain in Seattle on Halloween. Did it last year, now this year, and I was soaked. I went as British 90s Brit pop guy, and yeah, you can see pictures on Instagram and Facebook. I put up some of my pictures of me on Halloween, and so yeah, that was great. But of course, we got a talk to give today, and a little bit more of a serious tone. I mean, I guess they're all serious tones. Always trying to kind of work through how we communicate with others well, and what kind of tools we can use to do that. So yeah, we're going to talk about a very hard verse to look at as well. A lot going on, so we'll jump into this. And I'm hoping to do some next week, maybe looking into some of Tillich's philosophy and theology a little bit more. And but who knows? I just like I said, I didn't get into this to talk about politics all the time, but at the same time, I think we're at a place where it's the crossroads, they're just the streams are crossing and getting intertwined over and over again. And I think it's important to talk about. And so today I wanted to focus a little bit on tradition. And really, they're growing up in different churches, my life, in my youth and teenage years and 20s, there seemed to be a consistent way in America of how Protestants, especially um, evangelical Protestants, thought about God and Jesus and religion and the church and how it's supposed to work and how it's not supposed to work. So you kind of get caught up in this world, and you're part of it, and it doesn't always make sense. That's one of the really things I find interesting is that it's not always something that makes a lot of sense. And I thought it was important for us to look at this because I think sometimes we're doing ourselves more of a disservice. And part of reform is, as Phyllis Tickle used to talk about, is that every 500 years the church needs kind of a reform, a garage sale, get rid of the stuff that they don't need. And we're at that point, maybe a little past that point right now. But there's so much that we've created this culture that almost has created a bubble around us. And rather than being a part of people's lives, we're always just trying to invite people into the bubble, or like, it would be like if you had a bunker, you know, and you're like, and this is how we do things. And we have certain ways of talking in the bunker, and we have certain rules and regulations, and everybody goes by this and thinks this way and speaks this way. And Christianity, in a way, it was really phenomenal. And I think it's kind of Christianity with capitalism, because then we were like, oh, well, let's do this. We'll have Christian rock music, and then we're going to have Christian music festivals, and we'll have these type of, Southern gospel videos, and we'll do this. And capitalism grasps it, and there's this whole culture around it. And, it's got its own language. It's got its own style of dressing. It's got its own customs. And some of those things I feel like have built up a wall from humanity. And in some ways, that wall that was, I don't know, meant to keep us right with God or holy and pure or whatever, um, started to deflect, started to keep humanity out of it. And we lost compassion. We've lost particular types of compassion, particular types of empathy, and we've stopped living life on life's terms in a lot of ways. And relevance. It's so funny, church is always going for relevance. Is it putting couches in your service? Is it, having a good youth group band? Is it, I remember in the early 2000s, there was people would get musicians. They would hire all these musicians, and half of them weren't, Christians, but they would get up there and be like, we worship you, Lord. They're just getting a paycheck because they thought, well, that's how we're getting butts in the seat. Who cares if the performers are who they are? We just got to get butts in the seat. So it's a real strange kind of, the churches want to be relevance, and then at the same time it's fight against being secular. But usually the need to be relevance always kind of dives into what are they doing over there outside the bubble. you know we'll get some big screens and well produced plays, and we'll run church like IBM, or like a business. And I remember one time my friend brought his dog to to church, to his office at church. Sweet tea. You can take the boy out of the South, but you can't take the South out of the boy. Um, I'm drinking sweet tea for the listeners. Um, and his boss came up to him and was like, "Yeah, do you think that, like, if you worked at IBM, they would allow you to bring a dog into your office? Do you think that's really the professional ethics that we want? I mean, if you wanna run your church like a business, I get it, you want it to be like a corporation, like IBM, okay, it's not my thing. But I just remember that their goal was more like, "Sorry, you're having issues with the dog daycare center. We wanna be like IBM." And I always felt like that kinda spoke out of some sort of unconscious desire that a lot of these churches had and still have. And you know, I'm not here to shit on the church today. What I'm here to do is try to encourage us to think differently and think productively. And rather than saying, well, let's look for relevance, let's look for humanity. Can we show humanity? And I guess a lot of the things that concern me is because I do talk about politics. I do try to focus not on people over politics and people over party. But when you do that, a lot of assumptions come with that. And then, when you confront, and I've been equally as confrontational with the right and the left, um, people make a lot of assumptions. And when you start making sense, sometimes they'll start to rebuke you in the name of Jesus rather than try to argue when they start to lose the argument, which I find is a very strange thing. I've had it done in very extreme ways and very light ways. Uh, but the reason it gives me concern is because it feels like there's this uh, more of a dependence and a more of a faith in the politicians than in within their faith or following their faith, even though these are people who would b- live a very rigid faith compared to me, and I often wonder if it's an unconscious sort of disbelief in really in what they believe and what they follow to. If the unconscious is like, oh, because it's easy, like they be and it doesn't always make sense. It's not like, oh, well, these guys are helping people. It's like, well, these people are hurting people, but this is what the culture over so many years have said, this is who we follow. So we have to create a narrative that they fit into rather than saying they don't fit into the narrative and this isn't the most loving thing to do. This isn't really worrying about the least of these. This isn't that, instead it's like, we're going to make excuses for them. But a lot of people in their congregation are constantly being told like, oh, you can't dabble in sin, you can't do this, you can't, justify your sin and things like that. But then when it comes to our leaders or things like that, it's like somehow we create them into saints or gods or idols. And I think it's a dangerous thing to do, and so that's kind of also where this talk comes out today. Wasn't sure if I was going to call it the American tradition or not because I've been to other countries and seen this evangelical kind of way of thinking spread quite a bit. And to me, in some ways, it seems to be kind of like a very American way of thinking, a very capitalistic way of thinking. Um, but I believe some of these traditions are bad for the people. This kind of exclusive language that you'll hear, people argue with me, and be like, "I am a slave to Christ," and I am the king of the Most High is who I follow, and it feels almost like I'm talking to um, an actor at the Renaissance fair. You know what I mean? Like it's like, and so I had to the other day. I said, "Listen, I think I understand what you're saying, but I really don't use that type of language. All I can tell you is that I'm doing my best to kind of try to love my neighbor as myself." And love my enemies and do that type of thing. So, I'm not a slave or a bond servant or any of the other words that you've read in the Bible, or the King James, those are great. It's a great writing, but it's also 2000 years old. And so I think we're getting lost in translation here. Um, so it feels a little bit like that, and it feels like we're out of touch, not just with people, but for the people, it's like we really have kind of forgotten who the least of these are, and because we can't argue well, so we're not just out of touch and speaking a strange type of language sometimes in the church, uh, but we're just unable to meet people where they're at. We're not able to unable to meet people in their life terms and what's going on in them, and we often can belittle one another's convictions and things like that very easily. And you might feel like that's what I'm doing right now. But what I hope I'm doing is realizing like these are some certain things that we need to strip down. We need to ask questions. We need to think like, okay, maybe just having like a memory verse war. It's almost like having a fortune cookie war when you have like memory verses, or verses, and you're like, Matthew 5:15. No, what about 16? And it's just like, it's like you're pulling out fortune, just these little sentences out of context, going like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And we all do that. Unfortunately, it creates quite a division in life and in the church, and it continues to show like this hostility we have towards each other. Um, and unfortunately, it feels like people start to become an afterthought or even a nuance or a problem to be solved, like we're trying to they're a problem. Their politics are a problem. They don't think the way so I have to solve this problem. And I think disagreeing well, the best we can hope in disagreeing well or arguing well or having conversations is that we cause the other to have a thought, allow them to think and marinate in that, that and that they're on a completely different journey, obviously, because they believe a different way, they think a different way, they were born obviously in a different place, they were raised by a certain type of group of people. A lot of it is just accidents of birth, but that's where they're at. And I know often sometimes when I first communicate with maybe extremely conservative evangelicals, they get nervous. And it reminded me, I remember years, like 20 years ago, um, Carlo Iaconelli gave me this book, If Grace is True, and I was read through the book. And I put all these little red flags in areas where I was like, I don't know, I don't know about that. It seems a little, little, little heretical, And a few years back, I was like, oh, I should read that book again, and I was reading through it and I was really surprised by where I had put all these red flags because now I had spent more time in theology and in biblical scholarship and philosophy, and I knew who the books were written were, and I also, this was written by somebody who had a deeper understanding than me. But at the place I was at, I thought they were compromising. I thought they were doing something wrong, and now I'm able to look at it and go, oh, now I see where they're at. And so sometimes we might be those people sending out those red flags that years later, months later, um, you kind of go, "Oh," they wake up one day and go, "Oh, that person I was talking to wasn't insane." I mean, I don't know how many I've received so many text message and emails and even good old fashioned letters from people who are like, "Hey, I used to think you were this. I didn't agree with what you said, and over time I've just struggled with things and now I'm there and I want to apologize because I stood up and was yelling at you in the middle of a talk or something like that." And so change happens over time. And I'm going to guess that maybe that's one of the reasons why patience is a virtue, um, because what we're trying to do is encourage each other to live better and help others live better. You know, um, for me, this isn't a thing about getting people into heaven and out of hell. It's to get them out of hell now. Um, I can't remember the name of the author of the book, if Grace is True, but I think it was 2 authors. I think there's 2 authors because I remember I put up a quote once and I was like, "Oh, I've gotta which one said this?" Um, so when people become an afterthought or kind of nuanced, not a nuance, a nuisance, I'm sorry, a nuisance, when people become a nuisance and a problem to be solved, other things become issues. Diversity is seen as kind of a sin or or type of heresy. Different thinking becomes, you know, unquote. I've gotten a few very conservative Catholics on Revolution on our Instagram lately, and they were like, "Bow to Rome, give to," And so I'm talking with them. Well, this is my opinion on Rome and on that, and on the Crusades and all this stuff. And this one guy put up this big thing, this big video, and I thought it was hilarious. I kept it up. I actually shared it. Um, this big like meme, and it was just like heresy alert, heresy alert, heresy alert. And I was like, awesome. Um, but also I felt like we were able to kind of have a conversation, and I was able because he's like, "Why are you going to be rude to me?" And I'm like, I'm not trying to be rude, honestly. I'm just trying to tell you what I believe, and obviously we have different ideas of what this faith is and what we think about it. So we're just having a conversation. We're disagreeing, kind of remind him like it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. We can continue to have this conversation without uh, wanting to send one another to hell or call each other heretics or things like that. I mean, I think the concept of hell is so problematic is because I think that's why so many people think, well, if God is willing to do that type of thing for eternity, um, then I have well, then obviously God's not a good thing. Something God thinks a being in the sky. I don't really. I think God is more of the ground of being. But anyway, another talk. Um, but then they go, "Oh, okay." You wonder why they become so arrogant and so and I see these people defending their just anger and their God. Jesus was an asshole, and I could be I'm going like, you know. But who was Jesus talking to when who was he confronting in that way? They seem to forget that who Jesus was confronting was usually the religious people, that he was a little bit more direct with than like the woman at the well or the woman at the table or, the blind. These people Jesus seemed to show a lot of compassion and mercy towards. Um, and one of the things I think it's good to remember, and one of the things I've learned in over 30 years of doing this is that a lot of people who are struggling with mental health issues connect to churches and come to churches, and sometimes they have much deeper issues than this, and often they're looking for a way to feel better and some certainty in a time of doubt. And so sometimes you got to realize that it might be time to stop having certain conversations, because sometimes these folks are just like this guy the other day who was just like, "Are you saved? Are you born again? Are you?" And he knew me and he knew my dad. He knows what I do for a living. And this was all came out of me saying something about our president. So this guy was, what school did you go to? And, all this demanding, but you could tell that, maybe there was some sort of security that this person has in being certain. Maybe this certainty it frightens them. And the only way he can think that someone can disagree with him is if they don't really follow Jesus or believe in Jesus. And then they'll tell you stuff like, well, even the demons believe. There's really often these no-win scenarios. And I think if we have to look that we're putting people in a place where they have these no-win scenarios, or we continue to trick them and do things like that, maybe that's not really a human way to live. I feel like people don't necessarily need the Bible to be loving. I think there's a lot of people out there who don't follow Christ and don't go to church who are a lot more loving than people who do. And that's just a fact of life. That's just a reality. And I think that we've got to look at that and see that and ask ourselves, is my religion, is my faith turning me into someone who is now harmful to people and harmful to myself? And have I become more judgmental? Have I become more angry? And this doesn't just happen to people on the right. This happens to people on the left just as much. But have I become someone who's now willing to not even have a conversation? Have I become someone who can't even sympathize with somebody who's going through something, or addiction, or a struggle, or things like this? Have I become, you know, almost a monster of someone who's just like, have I become like this legalistic, angry person who has their own idea of what a purity culture is? I mean, I think the left has a purity culture and the right has a purity culture. And sometimes the left is harder, man. Sometimes the left is like, I don't know, are you really, do you believe this? They want you to, you know, have instead of all these different confessions. They might not be biblical confessions, but they're how liberal are you? Um, so when we start to see difference of thinking and diversity of mind as a huge problem and a big issue, we may be the ones with that issue. And I think that's something vital to think about. And think about, am I dealing with people who are struggling with a mental health issue? Is this go deeper than just a theological conversation? Is there a way to maybe help this person connect in a positive way? It's not very easy, but is there a way to help find this person some help that they need? Maybe find some security because they seem to be suffering. Um, there's often such a loss of perspective, and I see this a lot within conversations that I have about people and things about faith and statements about God. And they don't seem that their perspective becomes so focused only on a very small, like maybe their country and two or three other countries. You know what I mean? Like they have this perspective of, "Oh, this is how God works." But if you have a worldview, a bigger worldview, you start to go like, well, if God works that way, then why isn't God doing that, in the Congo? Or why isn't God doing that in the Middle East? Or why isn't that happening over here? So people get this idea of this intervention, this God who likes to intervene on things and talk about intervention. Well, God saved my child. You'll sometimes, you'll see a thing where kids were killed in a school shooting, you know, and the person, and they mean it. They feel it. They feel like God spared my child, but what is they saying to the people who lost their children is, well, I guess God decided not to spare your child. I guess God was too busy saving my kid and not yours. And I think we have to have critical thinking when it comes to speaking like that, and think, well, maybe your child was lucky. Maybe your child was taught well. Maybe it was just chance. Um, because often we're like, oh, God gave me a parking spot at the front of the mall during Christmas. I remember whenever we would get good parking spots, my mom would be like, thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Like Jesus was like, I can't handle this Congo thing, but you know what? Parking spots, I can't handle your cancer, but I can get you a parking spot. You want a parking spot? I'll get you one. Um, and so we kind of lose perspective and create this imaginary. I remember one time my friend was like, God didn't want me to go to this thing because my car broke down. I'm like, your car didn't break down because God didn't want you to go to this thing. I said, your car broke down because you weren't checking the oil and keeping up on that. Or, the van's 15, 20 years old. It was this idea of just this cultural, and this was a person who was kind of really outside of church, but they still had that concept of everything, you know, God got the blame or the victory, or there was always some sort of interwoven meaning to something. And we get into this like magical thinking. Yes, someone wrote Sky Daddy, and it's like, but the Sky Daddy is like an abusive parent at times. And I used to feel that way most of my life. Well, not most of my life, but the early part of my life. It used to be most of my life, but I'm going to be 50 in December, so now it won't be most of my life. So they fail to see that make their logic work for something globally, and end up creating really a God for them and maybe their country. And so that's when it's time to come in and have a conversation. I had one today, and if you look on Facebook, you might be able to find this one. Please don't give the person a hard time who I was talking to, but I'm not going to say who they are. I'm just going to read what they wrote to me, and not even the whole thing. I'll just read the first part, um, because I think it's interesting. Um, and it was the idea that God is, you know, in control of who's in power. And we're going to talk about Romans here in a second. We're going to cover that. I forgot to change my watch. Oops. It's not 12:30, is it? Uh the extra hour of sleep was lovely though. So lovely. I have the kids and it was a lovely little extra hour of sleep. Um First off, they says God have stopped presidents from being elected. God has no limits, does he? And then it goes on to things about the blowing up of the boats and Charlie Kirk and all this stuff. Um, but then again, it's this very limited American view of God. And when you go like, well, God has, stopped presidents from being, that's when you look at like genocide and you go, okay, well, God's not like, is decided like, oh, what does God do? Like, I'm going to make more traffic so these people don't get, or I'm going to not let these people off to vote, or I'm going to use these people's convictions to vote for somebody else. I mean, like God's got these chess pieces, and these would be the same people who would, a lot of these people would tell you that like Calvinism is heresy. You know what I mean? So it's like this thing is like we we have a God that seems to like is a puppet master, but often it's like this puppet master, but then you look up and then it's that person above God being the ultimate puppet, so you have a puppet doing a puppet doing a puppet. And because it works just for their logic or just for their small world or just for what the things their pastor's talking about in their politics or whatever news channel they're watching. Um, and so you get these folks, right? Well, God decides leadership, and it's pretty interesting how that works in times, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's just interesting to me that God, you hear often more that God put the conservative in, and then I guess whenever Democrats win, God was busy doing something else. Um, like God's in moving chess pieces, and like I said, we're looking at Romans in a few minutes. This interceding or intervening, I mean, for the candidates while ignoring the suffering of most of humanity. When you see the suffering that's happening, and you want to have a small American look at that suffering, you can look at the, murders that are happening, in the world, or hurricanes that happen, or the wars that we support and we finance, or look at how ICE is treating our immigrant brothers and sisters. And you'll see people who will who are called to love the least of these, but they will find an asterisk in there, just like we find asterisks in grace. They'll find an asterisk in there to go like, well, these people are disobeying the rules, so they can be treated cruel and awful. So now all of a sudden, the whole thing of loving your enemies isn't really loving your enemies as yourself. It's just I don't know what it is. It's like, let them be, their families be torn apart, let them be treated horribly, let them be thrown into prisons without any, into cages. And conservatives and Democrats both have played in this. So, folks, this isn't just one group. Both sides have done this. We've all probably voted for people who treated immigrants inhumanely. But the idea is like, why isn't God intervening in these areas then? Why isn't God intervening in the Congo? Oh, maybe because we all keep buying phones that have all these minerals in them that are there, and so that war is never going to stop. Lots of justification for the things that that are nonsense, and show the uh, almost why they want to point to an all-powerful, loving God is when that God is kind of in their corner. And so these are questions we have to look at when in other people, but also look in ourselves and make sure that we're not playing the same games. Because it's real easy to be like, well, I got it right. And Jesus, I think Jesus would have been a Democrat. And this is, yeah, well, maybe Jesus, wanted us to have a choice with healthcare. You start getting into these things and it just sounds bizarre. And we're, over religiousizing things and become very religious people and seem to forget just these basic ideas of loving God with all your heart, loving your neighbor as yourself. I mean, one of the reasons my mom, I think, was so celebrated is because she just loved people and she loved them well. So anyhow, my daughter is supposed to be on her way here, and I just want to double check. Sorry, Dad duty comes first. All right, there we go. Um, and I almost create the God into such an opposite way of that it's God's not all powerful by using God saying, well, God's intervening here, intervening here. I'm like, well, you're just showing that God is very selective and kind of an abusive father and has favorites. And the Apostle Paul, you know, made it very clear in the book of Galatians, God is no has no favorites, has no special people. There are no certain, that person isn't more important than that person. Um, so there's this idea that Minnie's okay, on her way. um, that it's easy to ignore what's happening, especially when we're only seeing certain things, when we only have a limited view. And I think we all have to remember what a limited view we have even now, even though we have social media all the time, constant news coverage, all these podcasts. We got to remember that some of these people got things wrong. There's propaganda, everything's correct. But also, we don't know what's happening all over the world. And so when you speak of God, you should probably use reverence and compassion. And, maybe First John, if God is love. And remember, it also says, like, if you can't love people you can see, how can you love a God you can't see? I mean, just small things like that. Um, but also just basic humanity. Like, I feel like they're called, like, calling people back to being human and showing humanity and showing friendship and relationships, you know, and so these limitations of knowledge, we create this self-satisfying God, as someone wrote here. So they're creating God in their own image. Uh, Brennan Manning used to say, "God created us in His own image, and then we returned the favor." I always liked that quote. Um, and what happens is we have an incompetent God that can only work with what they see and value. Because doubt and questioning and disappointment is too big for such a God. And this is why they claim an all powerful and intervening in American politics. You know what I mean? It's like, well, God's all powerful, but all of a sudden God can't handle questioning or disappointment. And we give God these like human attributes of really just whatever culture we grew up in, and we've got to remember those things. It's like you can't understand God. God is a God exists and does not exist at the same time. You cannot see God. You cannot understand that. And it seems there's a lot of people who think they can and think they do, and they'll tell you they can. Oh, I know I can. I can. Listen, I got the Bible right here. I'll tell you what God thinks about it. I remember one of my stepdad once told me that I know what God thinks about it. I can tell you the verse in scripture. Um, but let's say that we were all living in Northern Ireland in the 1980s in Belfast during the Troubles. I study a lot about the Troubles and a lot about Belfast and a lot about the Civil War that was going on there. And I was watching the BBC did this really amazing, like, I think it's like an 8-part documentary. And you kind of go from beginning of the conflict to the Good Friday Agreement, peace agreement. But one of the most shocking things I saw was these preachers, um, Catholic and Protestant preachers, and they showed different clips of them, how much each side was defending violence and hate towards the other. It blew my mind. I mean, I was so distraught by it. I had to stop it. I had to stop watching. I was like, these guys are pastors and look what they're saying. No wonder this all hell's breaking loose. And I called my buddy Pete Rollins, who was in Belfast and from Belfast and grew up in Belfast. And I said, man, I was like, for the love of God, man, the most disturbing thing I saw wasn't like these buildings being blown up. It was how horrible these preachers were. And he goes, oh yeah, so and so. And then he mentioned a couple of the other guys' names. And he said, but you know what's interesting, Jay? At the end, those guys helped usher in the peace process. In the end, those guys kind of saw the errors of their way and said, we got to find peace here. And so I think that's interesting. And I think that should give us some hope towards when we see people who are maybe legalistic and judgmental and saying things that are so far away from what I believe our faith is, that we don't give up hope, that we don't cancel them. Something happened in a change in these folks to go like, I can't talk about killing it. We got to have peace is much better than this. What have I done? I've let anger consume me. I've let hate consume me. I've allowed this war to consume me. And it happens to people. And often the change that happens in those people turns them into peacemakers. So these are little reasons why I continue to hold on hope in this crazy world we're in right now. At least, in the United States so far, and I think some of my friends in London seem to feel the same way. But, but our culture of God would be seen much different of how God acts and works if we were in Northern Ireland at that time as well. If you were, uh, if you were Protestant or you were Catholic, that's going to look a lot, God's going to look a lot different. Hold on, I'm going to just let Minnie know I left the front door unlocked. She can just come up. I'm still in the middle of my talk. Sorry everybody. Minnie wants me to text that she's with you before I drive away. We are pulling off. Okay. All right. Sorry guys. Dad duty. Just be happy that you go to a church or gathering or things where people give a damn about their kids. Even in the middle of their talks. Their children come first. That happens because I was a PK and know when it feels like not to come first. Where are my notes? Yeah, so we would think God was a different way. Like when these Catholic, the young Roman Catholic folks reached out to me recently, I have not really ever had conversations with people who were so Roman Catholic that they were like, supported the wars in God's name, supported Rome, wanted you to bow down to Rome, and I've never done that. So their views and their thinking and our conversation is we're probably going past each other because there's such, they're in a different world, they're in a different reality, and I'm over here in a different world, in a different reality. Like if they knew, like, oh, this guy, he really is a heretic, he really is nuts. So we have to be careful not to create God in this image of ourselves or this image of our culture or this kind of thing, and we have to really, I'd say, be very careful when you say God is intervening in anything. That to me seems a bit presumptuous, wouldn't you say? So when your God is willing to intervene in some things, but then you can have to use that God also somehow to justify suffering and murder and mistreatment and ICE. When you're going at these was somehow put God in. I don't think God is in those things. I think the government's in those things. I think laws in those things. I think people are in those things, but I don't think God is in those things. I think God is worried about those individuals being arrested just as much as the people doing it. But the fact is we've got a horrible situation. And as human beings, we need to speak out for justice. We need to speak out for justice and humanity for all. I think that's vitally important. I believe in nonviolence, extreme nonviolence. And that was the other thing is people talking about Rome. I'm like, well, Christianity kind of stopped being nonviolent when Rome, we're having all these conversations. Or we can justify hunger and like SNAP benefits. Well, God called them. And so there's canceling the SNAP benefits. You see, it's just, it doesn't add up, and it doesn't work. But we so badly try to force it in. That's why I don't like apologetics, because I feel like it tries to force the Bible into being something that it's not. It's just pushing it into this thing. But it's, love is conditional and grace comes with an asterisk. All of a sudden that's where God is now, and forgive them, Father, that was just Jesus in a moment of weakness, all that kind of thing. Too much faith in the book, in the perfect book. I'm going to skip some of my notes because if I continue to go, this talk's going to be way too long. Maybe I'll cover some of these later. I think I hear Minnie coming in now. And they say how you know you by the fruits of the spirits. I did want to share this note real quick. And this idea that, God isn't covered by the fruits of the spirit. God doesn't have to be peaceful, patience, and kind. You know what I mean? It's always interesting to me that, well, those don't count for God, or what God's choices are making and how they affect us for our life. That's just what we have to do, you know. But we have to, maybe these things are just our traditions and our cultures getting in the way. Now, I want to talk about one of the verses that are often used on me uh, for this kind of talk is Romans 13:1. Are any of you familiar with that? That's the one where God puts everybody in control and command and things like that. And uh, I'm going to read it from a book, from a commentary from this book right here. Minnie? Okay. Just gonna let know, Mom, you're here. She made it in. I'm still doing my talk, sweetie. Minnie made it. But this, idea that God puts everyone in power, and we just have to follow it and listen to it and agree with it. And it looks like I picked up the wrong. That's okay. I picked up the wrong book, but I can give you a gist of what the book was talking about. Sorry. So this wasn't the book, everybody. It was another commentary. And I want to make it clear. I read commentaries by Catholics. I read commentaries by, atheists. I read commentaries by evangelicals. I'm always trying to, scholars who I really invest in, but a lot of the scholars I read come from different faith ideas, different religions, different traditions, and things like this. And so the idea is, if Romans 13 says, that God appoints all into government and does this, and we should obey them and this type of thing, and it's very problematic. It's very problematic because you're also going to have to say that about Hitler and Stalin and all this stuff. And I think often how we treat books of the Bible as these timeless works that were supposed to travel through time. And that's where context comes in again to be very important, to whom the book was written to, why the book was written, and all that stuff. Now, I can't context my way out of this one, though. I'm going to tell you that right now. So it's not like I'm like, and so the context is, boom. The only context I can give you is that it was written to Rome because Paul wanted to come to Rome. He wanted to talk to the church of Jerusalem. He wanted to go. He was writing a book, and he asked that book be spread all over the place. And so people could read it. And so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it. One of the authors that one of the scholars I was reading says, if you're looking for a verse we can't any longer be literally applied, look no further. You found it. Romans 13, 1-7. And I think we may be called to see this based on how we were raised, so, you know, here you see a lot of these people use these verses to say, well, that's why, you can't question Donald Trump. You can't question these people. And it's really funny, like they have that, but when it's the other candidates, those are okay to question, because they don't have God's hand on them. And I don't think I've ever in my life been like talked to somebody and been like, Romans 13:1, when like, one of my favorite candidates won, the candidate I like, well, Romans, you can't really question it, can you? So it becomes this real choice of how we are all negotiating with the Bible, how we're all negotiating with these rules, and how we're all like think it's consistent along the lines. But when you look at people, you go like, they're not really consistent with it. And I think there's some ways it's good not to be always consistent with it, because I don't think everybody's the same. And I think that's important to talk about. But one of the other things is that this author suggested is, could this be Paul's way of making sure that when the widespread letter fell into the hands of the Roman government, it would keep him and the Roman Christians safe? There are even a few scholars who would argue that this was added. Now, it's just very few. Like, there's just a very few guys who are just like, I don't know what to do. It was added. It had to be added, But there is that. But could it be that Paul was, I mean, if you know anything, Paul was killed by Rome, just like Jesus was killed by Rome, just like Peter was killed by Rome. So all these guys got killed in Rome by the Roman government. So I'm guessing they knew that Roman government was very serious. But that is one of the takes on that. Um, can we take Paul's words in Romans 13:1 through 7 as timeless? I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is no, we can't. And I think that's why, you hear scholars like Dan McClellan say we have to negotiate with this, you know, um, unless you want to give like every leader in the world just the complete God approved. And then that's when you have to go, it's just a mystery. That's it's like saying, like, well, thank God God saved my life. Thank goodness I wasn't a Jew then. Thank goodness I'm not in the Congo. Thank goodness my children don't have to dig in mines. You know what I mean? And then it becomes a very selfish thing and just like, oh, well, I guess God just thought I should be an American, and it becomes really like gross. It becomes really gross when you try to follow this type of thinking to its logical end. And it has no logical end. And it creates God out again to be like a schizophrenic monster who somehow really digs America or really digs certain countries and just really, and it just makes God this like really wishy-washy thing. And, you know, we forget our humanity. So, that would be my query. So, no, is a short answer. Should we see this verse as universal? No, no, we shouldn't. Unless you want to say Stalin and Hitler and every other leader, uh, every political leader ever existed was put there by God. I mean, well, I just believe God's that powerful. Okay, well, do you believe that we have free will? So then you come to that, and then a lot of those people, well, of course. Well, then why is God intervening in these ways? Why would God send someone who doesn't care about the poor and the least of these? Is it to make us care more about? I mean, you could figure out ways to try to make it work, but at that time you're doing acrobats. You're like an acrobat. Oh, we do over here and we reach over here and we put this to this. Maybe we can make it work. Is it uncomfortable for me sharing this with you? Yes, I'm a Paulinian guy. This is an actual Paulinian text. I want Paul to be right all the time. I want but Paul's a human being. God's no respecter of man. Paul doesn't have it all together. And I don't think Paul thought we would be reading this book 2,000 years later saying, giving credit to all these people. I kind of want to side with the idea that Paul was keeping his people safe, because when the Christian Jews and the non-Christian Jews got together, sometimes there was a lot of stuff. And I think if you're coming into a country, you want to be like, oh, I'm cool, man. I want everybody to listen to you guys. I'm good. That would be my best guess. Could it be a call for peace in some misguided way? Perhaps. Is it naive? Probably. You also have the issue of where you didn't have Paul, freeing the slaves and doing things like that, because Paul literally thought Jesus was coming back at that moment and that time. So we also have to live with that, is that he was like, oh, Jesus will be back in like, months, maybe years, but Jesus is coming back. And so we really can't spend all our time fighting all this stuff. We've got to prepare people for the return of Jesus. And what that looked like probably doesn't look like what most of us think today. And like I said, not many will see this as a literal interpretation unless it supports them, unless it supports their kind of own prejudices and ideas and thoughts and needs and wants. And it's also a good reminder that the Bible's not a rule book. It's not a guidebook. It's a collection of books written in history to groups of Christians and to kind of help us work and struggle with it. But you can't, like I said before, like if you were living in faith during the Troubles, or even during the, person of faith during the Civil War here, you're going to have different thoughts. You're going to have different ideas. Everybody thinks God's on their side. Everybody thinks God wants their team to win, you know, and it's complicated and it's very human, and you're dealing with people who have unconsciouses that they don't even understand, and mental issues they don't understand, and how they were raised and what they were taught, not realizing that we're all just kind of in a place because of an accident through birth. Um, so I think that's important to look at, important to question, and yeah, I'm not excited to give you such a non-answer, but that's the answer. That's what you so at least we're transparent. At least we're honest. I'm not going to try to force it in and be like, this is what it was. He had a wink. He had an asterisk that they forgot to put in. Um, so I guess this is how I want to end this thing is too often it feels like we have surrendered our humanity to religion that is not a logical or Christ. It's not logical and it's not Christ. It might be logical for our our group, our tribe, but when you get outside of that tribe, and then when you get outside of the world, and when you get outside of the country, when you get all these things, it doesn't become logical anymore. And I think we need to be able to be logical and have critical thinking, and that's why that's so vital. And people, well, you have to learn critical thinking. Well, then we need to be teaching people little critical thinking. If you go, oh, you have to learn that. Well, then start buying books and sharing them with your friends. Start talking to them about critical thinking. Maybe that's a good place to start rather than with religion, and then that door will open later. Some of us, you know, make idols out of our self-interest. I'd say all of us do. We get these objects. Where the object petite is one of what they called it. Sometimes in our lives that we think are going to fill our void. Feel like if I just had that money, or if I just had that car, or if I just had that house, or if I just had that person, I would be complete. And there's no being complete. If Jesus is going to fill that God-shaped hole, well, guess what? You got a bunch of other holes there too that aren't being. And so we're always looking for completeness. And I think what we have to realize is that we're never going to be complete, that we're always going to have a lack, and to accept that as part of life, because desire and capitalism will always promise to fill that lack. And unfortunately, so will the church. Oh, we'll fill it. We got it. We got it taken care of. We'll figure it out. You like the Ramones, you'll love the Huntingtons. That like, we're going to fill it. We'll have a replacement for you. And, we've got Christian, if you want to be a rich, wealthy Christian, we got churches over here for you. If you want to be poor, poverty, we got a church over here. You gay Christian, we got a church over here for you. But it's never going to fill that area. And that's okay. It's okay to live in the lack. And not have wholeness. If there was wholeness was available through Christianity or through even therapy, I feel like I would be at a place where I've done enough of both that would be there. So what have we become? Would we be better off without the collections of these writings? Perhaps. Can we reclaim it with scholarship and critical thinking? I think so. I think we can reclaim the faith. I think we can do that, but we're not just claiming it for us. We're claiming the ideals of love and compassion and unity through diversity, to be more open, to not cancel people, to forgive people, to restore people, to find the essence of these things. For me, it's often just because of scholarship. There's certain things I don't even look at anymore within this book, because I think, oh, okay, that was obviously to undo something that was actually written by someone who we know. This has more power for me, and that's how I put things. So yes, will that make us a flawless then and complete? No. We've got to negotiate. I can't tell you that, oh, this one's 100%, but remember when Paul said that? Don't listen to that. So we're in a place where it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to go, because it's not a perfect book. It can be a mess. And I'm about to even take you further down the darker hole of how dark this is. Okay, folks? The helicopters, they're sending us. The Christian Coalition is on their way to get me. Wow, that's helicopter is really close to my school, or my house. I live right next door to the kids' school. So there is no way that it's going to just be perfect. So we do our best to knowing we do our best, but knowing we can do better. I learned that in DBT, okay, and dialectic behavioral therapy. Dialects Dialectic is a really cool idea. I recommend looking into it, and two opposites can work together. It's really beautiful. And one of the things they said, I'm doing my best, but I could always be doing better. And it isn't this thing to be like, "Oh, I gotta be perfect. I gotta be perfect." It's just going like, as I grow, as I learn, I can do better. But right now, I'm giving you the best that I have, and maybe one day, and probably so, I will do better. Um, so what do? We use the tools given to us. Like, oh, I watched Revolution the other day, and he talked about this, and he shared this book with me. Maybe I could go check that out. You know what? Last week he shared the wrong book with us, and but maybe there's something good in that wrong book. I'll go check that out. And this is the people I listen to, and let me compare that to this, and look at that. And what is the how does what is the end road to this type of theology or this type of thinking? And when I'm wrestling with the text and when I'm negotiating with the text, where does this lead? And who does this leave out? Who does this not cover? Those are type of things. Am I missing something here? Do I need to look in psychology? Is psychology somewhere where I need to look? Or do I need to look at maybe I'll need to take a dive into philosophy? Or maybe I need to read, King or people like that, or maybe get into, whatever. I think I find things inspiration in music, I find inspiration in art, I find it in films, it's all out there. And I like to use the critical thinking, and I like to negotiate with those things. Um, for me, does it get in the way of love of God and equality of others? Is the big question. So if it gets in the way of loving God and equally as important, loving others, if it gets in the way, I move on. That's my trump card when I'm studying. Does it affect how others are loved and cared for? And not just saying like, "Oh, they got punished, so it must not know." 'Cause sometimes we need to be confronted, we need to be taunted, we have to pay a price for certain things. I get that. We have to obey certain laws and things like that, and we also disobey unjust laws. Uh, I get those ideas, but for me is when I'm looking at the scriptures, like, it says the essence of they'll know you by your love for one another, or loving God with all my loving my neighbor as myself, equally important, and loving my enemies. Is this covered in that, or is this somehow changing that or taking away from that? That's always been a big thing for me. And that's out of years and years of studying scholarship and biblical history and trying to understand Greek and Hebrew and doing all these things just to come back around to what my mom always had an understanding of. Very simple reading of the Bible, but always understood that love was the trump card. Uh, when I have when I clear a claim, I always try to run it through its logical end. Does it work universal? If it's a claim of God or it's a claim to be God, you know, is this a universal? Does this work universally? Again, I want to make it clear, like, when you read that thing about Romans, Paul was killed in Rome around 67 AD. They actually believe they have his grave there and his body there, and the bones in there actually go to that time. So it could actually be Paul. But Paul was beheaded. If he was a Roman citizen, he would have been beheaded. That Peter wasn't, so he was crucified in a very simple way that all a slave or a thief would have been killed, just like Jesus. But there is so much of the Bible we will never know about, and I think we've got to start to be clear about this. Um, it's when Paul talks about a mirror darkly, like I said before, a lot of philosophers, a lot of philosophers do talk about religion, and I do study that as well. I'm reading a book about Lacan, so I can read a book about Lacan and religion. I literally am having to read a whole introduction by Todd McGowan on Lacan, and it's like doing my head in to get to another place, um, to get to a better place. So, it's never ending. Um, but like I said, I read from atheist scholars, Christian scholars, evangelical scholars, Catholic scholars. One of my favorite scholars is a Catholic scholar. Um, but everybody has different, even these scholars will have different opinions, and then they'll talk about other scholars' different opinions. No one knows it all. No one ever arrives at the complete truth of this Bible and this book and these collections. Just never happens. And and anyone who says different is either lying or misinformed. That's why I really struggle with apologetics, biblical apologetics. It's just it seems really unhealthy and dangerous and ignorant. So, if anybody tries to say, well, like, we'll never know. Well, there are all sorts of different opinions, and you have to negotiate with those opinions and kind of go, okay, what is this saying to me? What am I doing here? And how can I explain it? But then remember this: when someone else comes with another opinion, be willing to realize that they had to do their own negotiation, because all the experts don't agree. And I think we've got to be clear about that. So, I think we've made an idol. And I remember, I think it was Brennan Manning again. And he said, Bibology, we make an idol out of this book. But then when you start to research it and study it and you look into it, it's not black and white, and then you got people who are just like, I'm going to stand by ignorance because if I learn anything, I won't believe, because they're so afraid of education that it'll rob them of their faith. I think even my parents were a little bit afraid of that. They're like, well, what philosopher, what theologians are you reading? Are they Christian theologians? And have you read, and always, my dad was always that, really concerned, like someone's going to spend their whole life learning biblical scholarship just to be like, I'm going to destroy Christianity. We would create like, they must be a villain, it's like, must be satanic. It's like the devil is in every detail that's outside of our understanding, or things that we don't know how to negotiate with or handle. So yeah, lots of stuff to think about, folks. And, I hope this allows us to be a little bit more humble with each other, a little bit more human with each other. And, and realize that some of this book actually sometimes makes, this religion and this faith actually sometimes robs people of their humanity. And for me, I'm wanting to help people who I feel like that's happening to, or their love for others that's happening to, and call them to put up so many boundaries. I'm trying to help them tear those down and rethink that and reform. I want to see a reform, but I want to see a reform where we're even able to hold this lightly, you know, um, and try to figure it out together and not be afraid of hard conversations and negotiations. Because that's just the honest truth. I wish it was different, man. I wish I wish it was certainty. I wish I could be like, oh, you know what? Paul didn't say that. What Paul actually meant was this, no, Paul got it wrong, or Paul was trying to save his own ass, or trying to save his church's ass, or Paul really thought that for that minute because he thought Jesus was going to be back in a few weeks or months or years, and that he didn't really matter, and it wasn't worth the fuss. I don't know. Can't answer it. Wish I could. So there you go today, folks. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being a part of this. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And you might say, well, Jay, I don't have a YouTube subscription. Please, if you can, subscribe to YouTube, and please like and subscribe to our talks. It really, really helps get us out there in the algorithm. There's so many evangelical wealthy people saying like, oh, there's not every jot and tittle. I even believe the leather is genuine, out there doing that type of thing, and compromising the humanity and safety of others through that, who are on here being seen every day, and that come up in the algorithms, and we're not real high in the algorithm. We're actually going to work with a guy, an influencer YouTube guy has reached out to us and said, hey, I got some ideas where we could just help get you a little bit more into the algorithm. So we're going to be meeting with him hopefully sometime this month. But that will help. Other ways you can help is by sharing this stuff on social media. That really helps as well. And when we share it on social media, like it, share it, now you can share it too. They get that little recycle button you can push, and it doesn't even have to post it anywhere. Just people who follow you will actually end up seeing it. You can also put it in your stories. That helps as well. But if you really, really want to help us, we can use your financial support. And we've had so many downloads that if a lot of people gave just a little bit, we could be okay. You can go to revolutionchurch.com and make a tax-deductible donation. We have PayPal and we have Venmo, and both of those are great for our nonprofit. We've got them so they're the nonprofit versions. You get your money, your tax write-off. It's the end of the year. Who doesn't want a tax write-off for Christmas? Hey, Merry tax write-off. But we really could use your support financially. The more jobs I work, the harder this one becomes. And this one, besides being a dad is my most important job. Dad, and then doing this and working with you guys is what I really feel called to do. So please help us in that way by going to revolutionchurch.com and making a tax deductible donation. Um, this is your church. You guys are, I work for you. I can't do it without you. And you make this possible. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful week. I will see you next week. And who knows, I might, if you subscribe and if you turn on the notices, sometimes I might throw in a video and it goes, well, bing, and you get to see a video, an exclusive video. So anyhow, love you guys. Thanks so much. I'm going to go. Me and my daughter are going to go to a mall and buy a little stuffed mouse that she's been wanting for a while. So that's what we're going to go do. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day as well. Bye bye.